Hello, 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 YouTube fam. This is actually a reread of my piece, Water Waster. I started to read it on a previous live broadcast and realized that I had printed two-sided. So, if you missed the first one, here I am again. My show and tell were these, I believe, Stegosaurus earrings, part of a collection of dinosaur earrings that I sent to my niece, saving a pair for myself and just for fun. The piece I'm reading today is called Water Waster. Uh, I've written some called On the Subject of Water, and so this one is actually called Water Waster. And it can be found on my blog, uruoallthat.com, which stands for Unofficial Research and Unsolicited Opinions, all that. This is also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5.5 pages. So maybe a bedtime story like a previous one was. Water waster! A not more than 10-year-old child yelled at me as she stepped in the crosswalk leaving school. I was topping off the engine, kneeling and turning the spanner wrench, righty-tighty, to close the fire hydrant. Residual water left in the hose that connected the hydrant to the engine needed to be released from the bleeder valve. It splashed, mostly on the street, a little bit onto the sidewalk, but also in a 2x2 or 3x3 square foot plot of dirt where a plant actually existed at the break in the concrete. It was not often that I got pointed and shouted at hostilely as a firefighter in a neatly creased navy blue uniform with shiny boots and a sparkling silver badge, except when I helped at an event for the toy program, where a young boy looked at me from the tip of my shiny boots to the top of my shiny forehead, taut from hair pulled back in a bun, and said, "What are you, a fake cop?" Being accused of being called fraudulent was more insulting than being accused of being a cop. Being accused of doing something wrong while I was adding water to the tank of a bright red fire engine while on duty was more shocking, especially given the fact that the rig proudly featured the city's name in gold writing. The reason I was even topping off the tank that afternoon was because we had actually used it on a small outside fire or something, which meant not only was I on the job, I was doing my job, serving the city I had sworn to. I was practically on my knees when I heard her louder than the school bell that had rung moments before. "Water waster!" she shouted about halfway between the corner I was on and the one she was leaving from. "Hey, gotta have water on hand in case we get another fire. We need to put the wet stuff on the red stuff." I tried to make it humorous and approachable using a common phrase we learned in the tower that kind of rhymed, a simplification of the act of firefighting. I was trying to speak student, a language I knew well. I had been a teacher a few years earlier. It felt like ages since I had been inside a classroom. The only time I went to the school across the street was for building alarms and sometimes career days or fire drills. No one knew me there. They didn't know how bittersweet the sound of recess was, sounds of laughter and play echoing across the street as I tried to read a book in the dorm room. They didn't know how hearing the daily announcements and students of the week made me miss a time that I so enjoyed. One that I thought I would never return to because of the pay cut it would entail. Life in the Bay Area circa 2015 had gone up as quickly and steeply as the Salesforce Tower we can all see, but few of us have been atop. One that probably feels the condensation of clouds. Water waster? How very California. She had probably learned about the drought at school and at home as comfortable as she was addressing me in such a tone, especially being in uniform and an adult she did not know. Water waster? Did this righteous, young, naive Bay Area child, like I once was, know WTF she was talking about? Try a time waster, young buck. That was more like it. I was a time waster. Off the clock. In fact, that little know-it-all did not know that I was an alcoholic. Had the hydrant been pumping cognac, tequila, or beer, I would have been licking the bleeder valve or have my lips locked on the hydrant outlet tighter than the spanner wrench opposite. I had probably drank more alcohol than I added to the tank, which held 500 gallons. When I say topped off, I mean that I added what we had expelled on some small outside fire. Perhaps one not far from the encampments where people had no running water. I wonder if the young do-gooder was aware of that, aware of how messed up life could get, how water took on a whole new meaning when you were no longer school-aged. Yes, water. Water was clearly a big deal to the child. Water had been a big deal to children and Californians since I was a child, too. There are always droughts and campaigns for water conservation. People try to limit showers. Homeowners who can afford it get drought resistant plants. Lawns are frowned upon in liberal cities like the one I served. I remember being a child and hearing about droughts in California. Save water. Also, save the rainforest. Reduce, reuse, recycle. All these pleas for helping save an environment that was endangered when I was her age. This child was probably a second or third grader. I didn't want to tell her that I too thought people were going to give a fuck. And it turned out they didn't, or at least not enough of them, or at least the ones with power to make big impacts. They were too busy making bigger pockets. Yes, it is still important and impactful to recycle, compost, and conserve water. However, her policing me was minuscule on the scale of things. I wanted to say, hey, little Karen in the making, have they taught you about IGM capitalism in America? I get mine if you are a corporation, or they get theirs if you are a hardworking layperson in the USA, let alone the Bay. That was when those of us from here were still in shock at all the expensive changes that did not include us. I was born in the city where I worked, not far from the station or the hydrant where I met this young vocal water conservationist. If capitalism and the cost of living hadn't been so brutal, maybe I could have moved back and lived walking distance from work like she did from her school. I wanted to explain that as a department, the city had implemented limitations on our water use. We were being discouraged from washing our engines as often. We were asked to do a lot of dry drills instead of wet. The department as a whole was being conscientious. I was just topping off the rig in the afternoon because we had used it. I was being attentive, efficient, and safe. If she wanted to police me, she should have done that when I was off work. That is when I would have needed supervision or advice. That is when I did not do things as safely or efficiently. Though I did do things pretty routinely, like life can be in the firehouse when there is not an emergency. Off shift, I had a routine too, or a cycle, whatever you want to call it. After a watch, I would get off at 8:30 a.m., exercise, and then grocery shop. Next, I hit up the liquor store and then drank all day, starting with liquor and ending in beer and ultimately sleep. I would be stuck like Chuck the next day, like California. My body would feel like it had survived a drought. I would waste my days off drinking, doing nothing productive with my time. I would be in a constant state of consumption, alcohol and accompanying vices sometimes, or food to soak up the alcohol. Consumption. The opposite of conservation. That is what I did when I was not trying to be a role model. Consumption, the opposite of conservation. That is what I did when I was not trying to be a role model. I was a so called hero with an alter ego. What this little girl did not know yet, I could tell by her accusation and tone that spilled out like the leftover water on the street, was that water was the least of my problems. If she wasn't careful, or if she was, water could end up low on the list of her problems in the future, too. She could go through chronic stress, and she too could go through chronic stress and tragedies. She could bottle up her feelings and then drink them, like I did. She could fill herself up with grief, regret, and self-loathing. She could carry it around up and down the steep hills of life, like San Francisco has to offer. She could keep adding to her problems until they overflowed like the hose line. If she didn't find healthy purge valves, she could end up like me, a facade, shiny like the engine and full like the engine, not just with water, with booze and problems. There are global and local problems. Then there are personal problems. My personal problem was not wasting water. It was wasting time when I was not at work, literally drinking until my mind felt like my gums did with Novocaine, numbed pain. I served no one and nothing when I was off duty. I was angry at myself and society. I was drinking to beat my feelings to my idle time. I was mad at the state of the world. The USA I learned about when I was her age was as phony as the boy at the toy drive thought I was. Locally, the cost of living was insane. People were being left outside the doors of the Golden Gate and many buildings, businesses, and homes. People were unhoused, living on the street with no facilities to bathe, speak of water. As a department, we ran all sorts of calls, from medical emergencies to motor vehicle accidents, stabbings, shootings, overdoses, domestic violence. We soft restrained people in dangerous mental states. I had seen enough to not be too worried about a bucket of water. That is about all it was a drop of and in. Off shift, if I wasn't at the perfect state of numb, I would think about the people I missed, I was mad at, had lost, had wronged. I was mad my dad died under his circumstances. I was stressed about my brother. I wasn't proud of how I had treated some people who never deserved it. I would drink to dull the anger, to drown out the disappointment in myself and the world. I would express my anger and discontent as fluidly as the water that bled from the hose, because I was lined with alcohol like it was with rubber. On the surface, things looked good, just like in uniform. Reality was different. I was getting by. I had enough to support my habit and my household. I guess that is what work is for sometimes. Sometimes, being at work, I felt like my time was wasted in between calls, drills, and meals. Sometimes we would wait around for a call. Yes, we maintained tools and equipment, worked out and cleaned, paced ourselves for a long shift, and stayed ready. We had downtime, but couldn't leave the firehouse because we had to all be ready to jump in the same apparatus for an emergency. I guess downtime wasn't wasted time, though, because all of my time at work was my dry time. It was time that I was not drinking. I tried not to drink the day before work, too, but sometimes I would. I would try to cut myself off by nightfall. Usually, I would limit myself to morning hangover beers that I would cut off by the afternoon. I would add clamato to make it a michelada breakfast. That was only if I could help myself, which got harder and harder to do. Every now and again, I would have to call in sick, as in close call to alcohol poisoning, too hungover to hang for a whole shift. The young student wanted me to concentrate on conservation and moderation. I was living a life of excess, extremes. I exercised hard as soon as I got off shift to start my day off with a workout because it was the last one I would do until I went back to work. It was the beginning of my bender. I would buy food then, or my spouse would. Once I was home, plan A, B, and C was to get inebriated. I could drink to extremes knowing I had a built in recovery day. I drank socially and antisocially. I didn't feel alone in the company of alcohol. I felt like no matter what, alcohol would get me there. Where? Where I needed to go. It would, at some point, if I did my part drinking it, get me to a place where my head was numb, somewhere on the other side of accountability or care. When I drank, I sought to pause my brain. I sought not to rack it. I sought not to be preoccupied by stressors or anger. When I drank, I really didn't care about water. Not until the middle of the night or the next day, when I was desperate for it and remorseful that I had shunned it or taken it for granted, like the student assumed when she called me a water waster. I did not enlighten her about my actual feelings and thoughts about water or life. I said nothing of all the dark things that caused me to waste time drinking. Instead, I just said, gotta have water on hand and put the wet stuff on the red stuff. That was the best simplification I could think of off the cuff. That girl is older now and hopefully part of an environmental movement like Greta Thunberg. If I saw her today, I would say, at least, I'm not wasting time. In fact, I'm writing instead of drinking. I also write a lot about water and how it is a precious resource, just like public education. I work at a school again, where students know me and I do a lot of yard duty. I care about water, time, and people. I get to show it on a daily basis. When I'm not at work, I also like to make up for lost time by writing and drawing, purging and playing instead of wasting and consuming. I was in a funk then, like Callie was in a drought. Unfortunately, Callie still struggles with droughts and will likely continue to because of the state and world. Climate change is real and real scary. I hope that all of us will be vocal like the young earth advocate. I hope we will all be brave and participatory in the fight against climate change, individually and together, as a team, just like we fought fire together as a team in the fire service. I will say this, I do still sometimes get into funks, but I remain hopeful, and instead of wasting time drinking, I write, which is why I wrote and rewrote this. That was my first whole reread, and I may edit it, but you will find it shortly on URUOAllThat.com. All that, Team Easy, that Beezy, wishing you love, care, and moon prayer times 2, since I forgot it last time, plus 1, since this is a reread, so thrice. Para ti, for you, for everyone. Have a great rest of your evening, and thanks for tuning in, which leads me to remind you to please subscribe.